I'm happy to be here today, and I'm going to talk about DiGA, Digitale Gesundheitsanwendungen, the kind of new concept since approximately 2.5 years in Germany on how to get your software or your medical app into reimbursement. So how to actually finance what you build for patients. And I'm going to talk about some practical implications, especially. So I'm going to talk about how to build such a DiGA in a very brief way, but mostly also give some insights from our experience since we work on a few DiGAs and especially a lot of medical apps, and got a lot of learnings along the way. So I want to share some of those. Yeah, I will quickly check if the slide switching works. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so Anna already perfectly introduced me. I don't think I have to say much about myself. I'm originally also a software developer, so also developed medical apps myself before, and that's also how we got in this industry. And yeah, I think I should just get started into it. And I will start with what is actually a DiGA. Maybe not all of you know. I would just give a very brief recap. So basically a DiGA is your medical app that is focused on a patient that fulfills a certain amount of criteria in order to get reimbursed by insurances. So you have a medical app and you have a lot of documentation on why you fulfill certain criteria that the regulatory authority, the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, gave out transparent criteria. And if you fulfill those, basically you have a chance, or you basically, if you fulfill those, you get into the BfArM DiGA-directory directly. And that's actually pretty hard. It's very hard to get in there, so don't underestimate the effort. More on that later. And if you are in the BfArM DiGA-directory, and that's the cool part, you get access to all of the insurances out there. Your software can get reimbursed by all the big insurances, and a doctor can prescribe it to a patient with a certain diagnosis. So you don't need to approach individual insurances. You get direct access to all of them as long as you fulfill all of those criteria and your application goes through. And that's a pretty new thing. And that's also good to compare with the state before quickly. Before we even had the DiGA fast track, that's how it's called, the path to reimbursement, to financing your application was harder, I say, in some ways at least. And for example, what you can still do is have selective contracts with individual insurances. So you can go to every single insurance, basically knock on their door and ask them if they would reimburse your app. And if they think you would, for example, save them money, they might reimburse you. And the problem with that is you have separate effort for every single insurance. You need to ask each of them separately. It's very sales-driven, not a standardized process. So there's basically no transparent criteria out there on how to get reimbursed by those insurances. And you need the clinical evidence usually from the start, like a clinical study or something like that, so they have more trust, which is good, but it also stops some innovation. And the DiGA fast track has a concept to do this with an evaluation concept. So you can already submit your DiGA for 1 year even if you don't have the full evidence yet that it gives a benefit, and it might be canceled at a later time though. And the other points are that I already mentioned is you have access to all insurances. The DiGA fast track is a standardized process, and the criteria are completely transparent. So if you fulfill those, the insurances are forced to reimburse your app. So they basically don't have any choice. So you don't need to haggle with them. You basically just need to fulfill the criteria. And another thing that is good to compare with is, for example, the medical technical aids register, which was and still is a way to get reimbursed, the Hilfsmittelverzeichnis. but the application is extremely slow. It might be that it takes you years from the submission of your application until you actually get approved or not. And the DiGA fast track enforces processing time. So if you submit your application for your DiGA, you will get a reply within 3 months, for example. There's even more stuff that is enforced here time-wise. So that definitely speeds up the process a lot. And in a nutshell, I don't have much time to talk about this process today, but becoming a DiGA is basically fulfilling medical device criteria set out by the medical device regulation, plus DiGA criteria. So you first need to be a medical device according to the medical device regulation, which means you need to have a quality management system in place, create technical documentation for your medical software, and you need to provide clinical evidence for the medical use. And then you need to fulfill the additional DiGA criteria, which are like interoperability, security, accessibility, data privacy. And for example, it must be focused on a patient. It cannot be like an app that helps a doctor primarily. And the most important thing by far is you need to evaluate the positive healthcare effect. So you need to prove that your DiGA has a positive effect for the patient. If you cannot prove that, you cannot get into the DiGA-Verzeichnis, which is good, because otherwise you would have useless apps in the DiGA-Verzeichnis that would get money from the public insurances, and that would be bad. And so they put really a lot of effort or a lot of pressure on you having like a very solid study for proving the positive healthcare effect. And then you have a DiGA basically with these criteria. And I won't go into detail here. Building a medical device is something you will need to learn along the way. How to do that. Basically, you need to stick to the MDR, medical device regulation, and a few different norms. I think the most important one is the ISO 13485 for quality management, and a few others for usability, risk management, and everything. And this is a complicated process if you do it the first time. So get a good consultant for that. That's also my advice. I will mention later on again. I won't go into much detail here. I will go to another point, which is about conducting the clinical study. Now I go more to the insights part, which is the stuff that we think is important to know as a startup. If you want to prove the clinical, the positive healthcare effect, you need to conduct a clinical study. And that is actually a lot of effort and costly if you outsource it. And you need to keep that in mind while planning your study or planning your whole development of your product and your startup. And just so you get a feeling, here's just like a rough estimation of how long it might take you. And basically the calculation goes like this, that the total time to conduct such a clinical study would be the time it takes you to get an ethical approval for your clinical study, so you can actually conduct it, which might be around 3 months. So you need to submit it. If you get the approval, you can conduct your clinical study. But of course, you also need patients for your clinical study. So you need to recruit those patients, and that's often not easy to get those patients on board. You need to find them. And if you have a rare disease category, for example, an indication that's hard to find patient, this might take a long time. I would definitely calculate a few months, and it might take years for certain categories, but for some categories like mental problems or something, it might also be easier. Just keep in mind that it's hard and people might drop out during your study as well. And then you have the study time, which is rather easy to calculate because it's bound to the prescription time of your DiGA. So if you prescribe the DiGA for 3 months and then you want to have a positive effect on the patient, then the study needs to be exactly 3 months long. And in this time frame, you need to prove that you have this positive effect, which makes sense and which is also required. And so let's say you have a 3 months prescription time, that's 3 months, and possibly longer if you have a longer prescription time. And then you have evaluation time. That's not the biggest chunk, but you need to write a report for your study and everything and evaluate the results, 1 or more months, I would say. And then you would get to at least 1 to 2 years, in my opinion. So it takes you some considerable amount of time, and this is something you should plan for your startup so you don't get surprised along the way. And another thing that many people are interested in is how much does it actually cost, because many startups would outsource this, for example, to a clinical research organization. They can conduct a study for you and recruit patients. My experience is this is somewhere in the 6 digits. So you would need to calculate something around that. And this is like not even that optimistic, or this is like this is something you should really expect. Like like studies basically don't have an upper border or something. It can always be more expensive, but you should definitely calculate 6 digits. So plan on that while talking to investors. Like next to all of the great stuff about DiGAs that I mentioned, I want to mention a few problems that we see, or I see, with the whole concept, and that you should be just aware of, I think, when you build something. First, the BfArM, the regulatory authority, is very strict when it comes to evaluating your DiGA, and they're even getting stricter, adding more criteria, getting even stricter with evaluating your study. And this is something that you should keep in mind, because it's not easy to go through. They will definitely check everything in detail, especially about the study. Prescription statistics are still rather low. So at the moment, I think everybody's still hoping for those statistics to go up, and I think they will go up, but nobody knows how much. And I think for now, it needs to go up for a lot of indications to make them profitable, I guess. And this is also my next point about like how much you earn with this. This is like one thing that is important to mention is it's almost, I would say it's impossible to become like a unicorn or something just with a DiGA, because the market is just too limited. And also, in general, you will need to address different markets next to Germany, and only the DiGA financing model will not give you enough money to build like a huge kind of company that scales like crazy. Probably my best guess is that more small or medium-sized businesses will be created from this, and a few of those might then go to different financing models or go to different countries and then become bigger. So the DiGA concept might be a good starting point, but if you want to go big, you should watch, you should check out other financing models as well, of reimbursement models. One thing that is really important to mention as well is distribution, marketing, sales is extremely challenging and costly. So this is something that many startups, in my experience, might underestimate, that it's not even clear that the costs of distribution are lower than the earnings you get from your DiGA. This is something you need to evaluate for every single indication or every single DiGA separately. And for some of them, it might be worth it, maybe for bigger indications. And for some of them, it might not be worth it, because it's just very hard to reach those patients. And this is something you should keep in mind, which I also come back to later in the recommendations. And the last point for problems is keep in mind that your DiGA is almost frozen once in the directory. So basically changes are so costly that you won't be very agile once in the directory. If you change something fundamental about your DiGA, then it's very likely that you will need to, for example, reconduct your clinical study. And this is something you will probably want to avoid completely, because it's so costly and takes so much time, as I just explained. So yeah, you're basically, you will stick to a certain functionality for some time probably. At my last section is some practical recommendations to possibly show you some blind spots or stuff that you should keep in mind while building your DiGA. And my first recommendation is build something proven and simple. If you want to get into DiGA-directory quickly, ask yourself, do you really need, for example, AI involved? It's cool because of innovation, but in another way, it's much easier to get in the DiGA-directory if your application is, for example, digitalizing an existing care concept, for example, that's already proven with studies. So you will very likely also prove the clinical benefit of your application because it's based on something that's already proven. If you build something with AI, it's very likely that it's not proven yet, and then you might, the result of your study might be that there's no significant benefit for the patient, and that's really a scenario that's bad, because then you need money for another clinical study and need to pivot, and it's very costly, especially in the healthcare sector. The second recommendation is get a really good consultant for medical device topics. The whole area of medical device regulation is overwhelming in the beginning if you don't know anything about it. And if you have a bad consultant, it stays overwhelming. You will basically never really understand what everything means. If you have a good consultant, he can teach you everything in a pragmatic way and help you get on the market faster. So look out for pragmatic consultants that really have hands-on mentality to help you get on the market fast. If you're interested in some contacts, I also can refer 1 or 2 people. There's actually not that many good consultants in my experience out there. There's a lot of them that are very slow in their process or in the impact that they have on your startup. My third recommendation is use the counseling by BfArM, the regulatory authority, before you conduct your clinical study as well. Talk with them, so identify deal breakers together with them so you don't have a big surprise in the end. My fourth recommendation is go for a class 1 medical device. If you can somehow prevent it, don't go for 2A. It's a lot more effort because you need to have a notified body involved which audits you, and it will take more time, will be more cost intensive. And if you have a class 1 device, it's just much easier. The problem is it's not very clear which devices fall into class 1 and 2A at the moment. Everybody has a different opinion, but so far it's looking very good for DiGAs, because every single DiGA at the moment is in class 1. So even under the new regulation MDR, so you definitely have a good chance to be a class 1 device if you have the right kind of benefit that you want to provide, or the right intended purpose. And my fifth advice is don't think being in a DiGA-directory is success. The distribution is actually maybe hard to say if it's harder or if it's the same hard as building the DiGA. But if you're inside, you need to make doctors prescribe your DiGA or make patients aware of your DiGA so that they can reach out, that they can kind of prescribe it to themselves. And if they have a diagnosis, of course. And this is something that's hard. Maybe pair up with a pharma company. Some DiGA companies do that because pharma companies actually do that on a daily basis. They have this huge sales force to get medicines to doctors. So this might be a smart idea. My sixth advice is do enough planning for your clinical study. You will likely not have enough money for 2 clinical studies, so get it right on the first try. And don't make the mistake. We've seen it before that maybe you realize in the study that you're basically proving the wrong thing. Maybe that won't get you in the DiGA-directory, or you realize that your whole study concept is flawed and you won't be able to prove anything with it. So this is something to plan very well. And my last advice is the preliminary listing, which is providing an evaluation concept instead of a full clinical study, is not always the best option. Most startups, I think, in my experience, would go for that option because it's less effort in the beginning and you get money earlier. But the problem is you might get canceled then after 1 year. You only have 1 year to provide the full study. And as I calculated previously, 1 year is really not enough time to conduct a clinical study. And it's highly likely that you will need more time. And if you don't have a solid reasoning, they won't extend you the time. And if you say, I didn't have enough time or I didn't get enough patients, that's not a solid reasoning. BfArM won't accept that. Basically, you will probably stick to 1 year, and already 2 DiGAs got canceled. So keep that in mind, and probably more in the future. So yeah, consider the permanent listing conducting the clinical study in the first place. That's it. Thank you for your attention. Everything that I said is all of the problems I want to say are just so you're cautious. I don't want to stop you from doing this, but just be careful along the way so you don't have any deal breakers. Thank you.